Hello, everyone, and a great time of the day for you. My name is Flora, and I'm one of the organizers for the Contributing.today meetup. Not only this one, but actually for all of the ones that have been before. I've been working in technology for 12 years with an emphasis on open source. Contributing Today is a mostly weekly show covering open source technology topics. Maybe you're a regular, or maybe this is the first time that you're tuning in, especially for the topic of licensing. Either way, please let friends and strangers on the internet know that you're watching this show by using the Contributing Today hashtag on Twitter. Also, join our chat, either on Discord or to the right of this screen, the chat that is embedded. Those are two separate things, by the way, so pick your poison, I guess. But when you're participating in the chat or on Twitter, please be mindful of our code of conduct and know that we're all here to learn from each other and share stuff, and that's the most important thing. You can find past recordings of our meetups on, for instance, Python or gaming or writing docs or funding and sponsoring or what have you, by going through contributing.today/past-sessions. And then let's get started, shall we? So we're doing a bit of a panel or sort of free flow discussion with folks from the FOSS licensing scene, and we hope that you join the discussion again. I am not a lawyer, so it's a good thing that we invited a couple of guests that either are a lawyer or, I learned during our briefing call, if you're married to a lawyer, that apparently rubs off and gives you a lot of insight as well. So first, it's my pleasure to introduce Josh Simmons to the virtual stage. Hi,
Hello.
Josh. Josh is the president of the OSI, the Open Source Initiative, a global nonprofit that promotes and protects open source software development and communities through education and advocacy. And you're also an ecosystem strategist at Tidelift. Am I right?
That's exactly right.
Did I miss anything?
I wear so many hats, I wouldn't even know if you did, but those are the two high points, certainly.
All right, awesome. So what does the Open Source Initiative do, and what does a president of such an initiative actually do?
That's a great question. So the Open Source Initiative is a nonprofit founded in the US in February of 1998, which is about the time when the word or the phrase open source was coined. So ever since then, the Open Source Initiative is a nonprofit, has worked as kind of a standards organization, maintaining what's called the open source definition. So when somebody creates a new license, they will submit that to OSI for review. And OSI runs a process, that's a community process that anybody can get involved with, to review a license and say, yes, this is open source, no, this is not. And so it's that community sort of decision-making process that OSI stewards and helps us all stay on the same page roughly about what open source is. Now, my role as president, I'm a full volunteer. I was elected to the board 5 years ago. I'm entering my 6th year of service on the board. My role is
we have an anniversary, a little anniversary. That's nice.
That's true. That's true. And it feels great. The organization has come so far in the time that I've been there, and we're just on the cusp of really transforming to be a staff-driven org, so that other people can volunteer without having the luxury of quite as much free time as I needed in order to do this.
Great. And I would love to come back to the review process of new licenses a little bit later on. But first, I want to introduce our next guest, who is Nell Shammerl-Harrington, who is the board director for the Rust Foundation, lead editor for This Week in Rust, and principal software engineer at Microsoft. Nell, you've previously been at Mozilla and Chef, and we specifically invited you for your work on the Clearly Defined project. So Nell, you've been our guest before, right? And we're happy to have you on the topic of Rust. So what's your favorite topic? Is it Rust or licensing?
They combine really, really well.
Yeah, that's a very smart answer.
Yeah, it's fun, being in, I should say I'm a board director. I'm on the board of directors for the Rust Foundation. It's now being in a leadership position, I'm seeing a lot of how licensing affects everything. So I like both topics, and it's great to be here.
Awesome. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the Clearly Defined project is?
Sure. Clearly Defined is both a database and a service. The data, what it does is it crawls package managers and GitHub repos, things like that, looking for licenses in open source projects that people request. So someone says to Clearly Defined, I want to know this crate, what the license is on this crate in crates.io. Clearly Defined will go out to crates.io, harvest up all that information, bring it back. It's possible that we might get sometimes there's a different license when you look at the GitHub repo. So Clearly Defined tries as much as it can to make a determination of what the license is most likely to be. If it's not clear, we have human curators who go into that and try to, in science it involves reaching out to the maintainer, figure out what the license is. So we want people to know that the open source software they're using is clearly defined with licenses that they're in compliance with.
Awesome, thank you. And our next guest to invite to the stage is Sami Haq, lead legal expert for ethical source and the Hippocratic license, I believe, staff attorney, human rights and intellectual property at Corporate Accountability Lab, and adjunct professor for trial advocacy at Chicago Kent College of Law. Illinois Institute of Technology graduate. That's a mouthful. Did I get it all?
I think you did. Thank you very much for having me, Fleur.
Great. Hey, so Sami, can you maybe talk us through what the Hippocratic license is and what ethical source movement aims to do?
Absolutely. I'll start with the ethical source movement. The ethical source movement is a movement that started initially with software developers in the open source community who felt that they wanted to limit some of the actions that companies and governments were doing with their licenses, with their product, and kind of taking ownership of that and understanding that there's a role that they play in some of the harm that's done in the world when it's their software that's being used in a manner that creates human rights abuses. And so this is kind of a way to take ownership back and make sure that, these organizations don't get to do that, or at least don't get to do that with their software. So they believe in the open source model. They believe the idea of proliferating the software and making sure that everybody has the ability to use it, but use it responsibly. And the Hippocratic license is probably the best example of that. That's one that covers a broad range of human rights protections that they want governments and other organizations to be held accountable to say these are the rights of people that will not be violated. But aside from that, the software is free to use and is well within the open source model.
Awesome. Thank you for that explanation. And then last but not least, Luis Vila, who is a tech lawyer, community enabler, and co-founder at TideLift. And TideLift's elevator pitch is a complete solution for managing open source. So hey, there's some free commercial there. In the past, Luis worked at and on Wikimedia, Mozilla, and the GNOME project. And I can totally recommend checking out his website, attorney.af, which wonderful domain, by the way, but he uses for his musings on open tech and policy. So thank you all for joining me. Tell me about this URL. This is so great.
So this URL is was a gag gift from one of my co-founders a few years ago, and I usually use lu.is. I'm an honorary Icelander for purposes of DNS. But yeah, this was just I like to think that so I have a terrible sense of humor, but by lawyer standards, it's terrific. And similarly, like I'm literally a professional pessimist. That is, I think Sami and I, there's like a certain part of your job that it really is to see the bad parts of things, right? But also, and before I actually got started in open source doing bug tracking, which is very much the same kind of thing, right? You're trying to understand what's broken about it, sift through the noise, and create something positive. And So again, by like normal human standards, I'm an extremely cynical, negative person. By lawyer standards, I'm filled with, rainbows and butterflies and light.
Sunshine and
Yeah,
glitter. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Hence the domain name.
Awesome, thank you. So, in preparing for this meetup, I did a little shout out on Twitter looking for maintainers opinionated about licensing, and I received a response over and over again where people were like, "Well, all maintainers should care about licensing, and they do, right?" But all too often I see folks that just slap MIT on their project as a sort of like, oh, that's a household name, that sounds good, and then be done with it. So do I live in a filter bubble of very lazy open source maintainers and citizens, or do you experience the same thing? Okay, it's like, no.
We can all just nod together and we can move on to the next question.
But why is that? Yeah.
I think, licenses are a means to an end. And I mean, I'll just speak for myself. I grew up with the advent of like peer file sharing and user generated content, and open source always just, to me, looked like a natural outgrowth of those same trends. And I think a lot of people just want to get the work done, and not really give that much thought to the role that licenses play in enabling the sort of communities and collaboration that we have come to appreciate. Part of it is because it just feels a little abstract. Like, what is a license really? How does it really play into the grand scheme of things? I will say, I actually appreciate the level to which people don't have to think about licenses. I think that's both a sign of success and a little concerning, but also a sign of success, because really not everybody should have to think about that. We really let's keep that a specialist thing so that people can get on with the work and doing really meaningful stuff.
Yeah.
Where I see the concern come in, and there are plenty of maintainers who are very concerned about their licenses, but I mean, part of the reason clearly defined exists is you have enterprises running thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of instances of open source projects. If one of those has a license that says they can't use it or they can't sell what they're using based on it, that's a huge legal liability potentially. So the lawyers really care about licensing, is what I've noticed, and you should listen to your lawyer. I say that as the person who was mentioned, who is also married to an attorney, but you should listen to your lawyer. But that's where I've seen more concern about it lately, due to the fact, the advent of cloud computing, when all of these services based on open source software are available on demand, are generating huge revenue. I think a lot of people are starting to realize we need to have more of a discussion about this.
Yeah. Let's get the sort of beginner questions out of the way. So can I call my program open source even if I don't use an approved license?
Oh, I guess I have an obligation to respond to this one. As president of the Open Source Initiative. You could call it whatever you wanted to, but if you were to call something without an open source license on it, if you were to call that open source, you would be incorrect. And you would be setting expectations that are not going to be met by reality. When you say something is open source, people have certain expectations about what that means. And if you're not using the open source license, well, then it's just not true. So I like to say that open source is a lot of things. The definition has become very overloaded over time. Another sign of success, I think, wherein open source often means for us, can I see the code? Is it open? Can I submit pull requests or changes, patches? Is there open collaboration? And then is there open governance, right? Like, what is the process by which this code this project is governed? And I think often when we say open source, we mean all three of those things. But the key is, if there is not an open source license there, you do not have an open source project. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. There are lots of valid ways to exist in this world other than open source. But please don't call it open source if it's not open source.
Yeah, and I think the important term also is like if I don't use an approved license. So what if I use a license that I made up myself or is not yet approved or hasn't gone through your process yet? Could I then still call it open source?
We would ask that you not do that, because the value in open source is really that it's a standard. It's a standard that everybody has a slightly different take on that standard, but there is a standard. It is a bit of a term of art, and there's something stable and consistent about that. So when somebody says open source, there's expectation that it's going to mean certain things and behave in certain ways. And so if we're using open source in a way that doesn't conform to that standard, then we're muddying the waters of that standard and raising the specter of license proliferation and making compliance work that much more costly. It's just better not to call it open source if it's not using an open source license. And by the way, there are a lot of great non-open source licenses out there. I just recommend don't roll your own license. Don't roll your own crypto. There's probably a license out there that'll do the job for you.
And do the crypto also.
Yeah,
probably.
I mean, we're living. I think to Josh's point, right? We're living there was a sort of historical period, late 90s, early 2000s, where open source had just taken off, and there was a ton of experimentation around open licenses, and that and the open source initiative, one of the things that the organization has done best was to say, this is actually not good for anybody, right? People were, for those who are not familiar, the phrase rolling your own crypto refers not to currency, but to cryptography, to security, because the idea is that, in fact, other people who know what they're doing have done it better, and you should really try to avoid, and it's a process fraught with pitfalls. It's really easy to make mistakes, right? And so there was this period of experimentation that really slowed, and now we're coming, for a variety of reasons, I think, both around the economics of open source and around, as I'm sure I would personally love to hear Sami talk more about, the ethics of open source, right? And this is a problem. Josh has used the phrase a couple times, that we're a victim of our own success, or that we're these are a lot of the problems that open source is having right now is because open source has been so successful that it is now everywhere, right? And that is both amazing and powerful, and also potentially damaging to the world. And we have to think about that in a different way. We're now the default in a way that we weren't 15 or 20 years ago, and so that really changes. A lot of these licenses were written with a very specific, almost like fighting against the world mindset. MIT doesn't have that, which is part of why it's so popular now, right? And now we're trying to figure out new ways of interacting with the world now that we're more influential.
And that comment about being a victim of, open source being a victim of its own success, I think is rather telling. The reason we're having this conversation, in particular around ethics, is because of that success, right? Because it has so much potential to do both good and bad within the world, and has done so much good already, that I think it's important to have that conversation. I think a little bit to Josh's point about the standards and this level of variance that exists within open source is, I think, why we can have the conversation about whether ethical source, fits within the definition of open source. Obviously, I think it can and it does, but I'm sure that there's some disagreement on which licenses do and don't, and to what extent. And I think we're trying to find a place. I think, in particular, to ethical licensing in the open source world, we're still experimenting and trying to find that right place where we can say, look, this is the ethics that we want covered as a community. And again, this is a community project. This isn't me as an attorney or a small group of people trying to come in and saying, well, these are the standards that we must meet, and this is how we're going to push ethics in this community. It's a collaborative project where we want to find that balance of, these are the ethics that we want protected, as well as still promoting open source as much as possible.
Yeah. And I wanna pick up on that a little bit. So did any of the ethical source licenses that are listed on ethicalsource.dev, have any of those gone through the review process that you know of?
I don't believe so.
Are you planning on doing so?
I mean, yes, we'd like to have. Obviously, we would. We want to work with OSI in kind of creating. Hopefully having something that we believe is open source. Of course, if we don't get OSI's blessings, I think we believe that our licenses would still be considered open source and would publish them as such. And in conjunction with that, which is why I think OES has partnered with the Corporate Accountability Lab and myself from working on the Ethical IP project, is to provide software developers with legal help. So if they have questions about how this functions, what enforceability looks like, that they can reach out to me. And obviously, if not with me, reach out to the attorneys in this space. So, they're all going to provide excellent advice in terms of how these licenses will function in a practical setting.
Can I push back on that, actually?
Absolutely.
This is going to get a little bit in the weeds for some viewers, but I think it's actually pretty important to understand because I think it inflects how we talk about licenses in this space, and it's connected also to something Nell said earlier about who uses open source. Almost all of the lawyers in this space, with literally a handful of exceptions, are employed by the either giant law firms or the giant companies that employ lawyers who work at giant law firms. And that comes with, I think, a very extreme status quo bias, right? Like anything that rocks the boat is really viewed with extreme suspicion. And I think that's I think the ethical source folks are feeling a lot of the brunt of that from time to time, and I think that's unfortunate, and I think it's particularly sad because this was something that rocked the boat like a lot, and we've institutionalized it in such a way. And this is a very human thing, right? Like this happens to all revolutions become the institution that they hated, and yada yada yada. But like, I think that I think you need to take the lawyers in this space with a little bit of a grain of salt because they're very much, and I include myself often within this, as where we don't want to be the ones who killed the goose who laid the golden egg, to use a slightly not quite right metaphor, right? And so we push back pretty hard in ways that sometimes I think might be a little unwarranted because we're just so essentially conservative. Right?
I think the term I've heard a lot
There's
is
no killing geese on this meetup, by the way. Just saying.
Sorry. Apologies to any geese fans.
Sorry, Sammy.
No, it's okay. I was going to say that I think Lewis's point is right, that I think attorneys are very risk averse, right? Like our profession, he touched about earlier about being a pessimist because you're designed to be, you're trained to be. That's our job, is to look at the risks and then advise clients, whether or not something is worth it. And ultimately, it's always the client's decision whether or not to pull that trigger. But our caution is always, be aware of these potential risks and always look at what is, the most dangerous outcome and try to advise clients to steer clear of that. So to that end, I agree with Lewis. Like, I think attorneys are always going to be risk averse, or at least the good ones will at least advise you and say, look, it's ultimately the client's decision, but these are the potential pitfalls of any strategy that you look at.
Perfect. And if there's any projects that you can share, Sami, that are looking at ethical licenses and maybe the Hippocratic license in specifics. So what are their motivations and maybe their reservations? I mean, I've heard the word it's difficult to enforce. Is that a thing that lives?
So I've heard that criticism a lot about the difficulty of enforcement. I feel like it's a little bit overblown in terms of that. I do agree that a lot of open source licenses generally across the board, I think enforcement is one. So like, let's take a look at the copyleft, because that's really the only one I could think of that would require a level of enforcement. Is if you feel like an organization isn't allowing derivative work to be entering into the open source space and they're violating a copyleft license, then the enforcement would look very similar to what an ethical license would look like, which is that, in the United States in particular, you'd have to, file for an injunction and go through a TRO, which is a temporary restraining order. Or if the license has its own type of enforceability. I know people have talked about arbitration, which is a little bit of a touchy subject amongst lawyers. But generally speaking, you would go to a court, you'd file an injunction and a temporary restraining order. And is there a cost to that? Absolutely. I think that eventually we need to work on reducing litigation costs in the licensing space and across the board. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily difficult to enforce. It's, can you gather, do you have sufficient evidence to be able to support that? And if you do, then there's a cost to it. It takes some time, and then you go forward with it. As far as projects with ethical source and some of the licenses we have a large list of them on the website that talk about different talk about different human rights abuses. The Hippocratic ones are, is more general, but there's more specific ones, right? The Anti-996, which talks about labor practices, or the atmospheric license that's more based on environmental concerns.
This plays into the from the other. It's a benefit of the risk-adverse legal environment. I imagine if you're a corporate counsel, and that corporation wants to use a license that its use is not in compliance with that license, they don't want to risk the potential of a lawsuit. Because as you said, it's expensive. It's very PR negative. So it kind of works in that way too. People question enforcement. It's not so much, I don't see as much enforcement as, do you want to take the risk that this will be enforced? And are you prepared to deal with the consequences of it? Which I imagine often the answer will be no.
People want a lot of people want certainty, right? And so often it's less about this question of consumers want certainty, right? And so for them, it's often less about enforcement and more just I'm not sure I understand this. And so underappreciated fact, I think, that might be interesting to some folks with a more historical bent here. For a long time, the general public license, which is one of the most, for those who are new to licensing, is one of the most widely used licenses and the originator of the idea of copyleft that Sami just mentioned. For a long time, lots of companies treated it as toxic. And IBM and some others funded a literal education plan to go around talking to attorneys about no, actually yeah, there are rules. Yeah, there are some tricky, weird bits, but overall, you can rely on this. You can feel comfortable using this in your corporate setting. And that was not something that happened overnight. It was a multi-year thing. And it was helped by all their engineers were screaming, can I use MySQL? Can I use Linux? But so there was a concerted educational effort. And I think that for the strongest members of this new wave of license innovation, there's going to absolutely have to be educational efforts targeted not just at developers, but at lawyers to help them understand look, the risk of you getting caught by the Hippocratic license is very low, or the risk is, very low unless you do X, Y, and Z. Your company surely don't do X, Y, and Z, right?
Right.
The thing is part of these things, everybody's trained. Let me tell you something about legal education. Sami hinted at this, but again, for the programmers in the audience, imagine if you got a programming degree where all you read was compiler errors. You never read any source code. You never wrote any source code. You just read compiler errors. That's what a legal education is. You're just reading what a judge thinks about a certain set of facts, which may or may not actually, the judge may omit things, the judge may put their own spin on things. It's a really weird way to learn how to do a thing, right?
No, absolutely. And to add Lewis's point about the process about licensing and copyleft, that's not unique to licenses in the software world either. That's true of contract law generally. Is that every time a new event happens, attorneys get together, whether that be literally collaboratively, or somebody starts writing a different clause that says, well, let's get around this issue this way, or let me write something to solve the problem of enforcement this way. And that's how now you have a bunch of stock clauses that you'll see force majeure clauses in licenses. You'll see defining the scope of a contract. A contract is very, very basic, right? We do it every day. You buy something at the gas station, a pack of gum, you've entered into a contract, right? And that concept, I think, has over time has now evolved into, now there's so many different standard clauses depending on how complex you want your contracts to be and how complex you want your licenses to be. But that's something that's happened over time. So this process that open source is going through with respect to ethical licenses isn't something that's, again, unique. It just has to go through this process to figure out how enforceable it is, and where it fits in the overall space of open source.
One thing I'd love to just tag on to that a little bit. The history of licenses has been a history of experimentation from the get-go. We've got there are licenses that have sort of do no evil components going back to the early 2000s. I think the late 90s, but I struggle to cite that one. So what I appreciate is that we see license experimentation along a few fronts. And over time, we've seen licenses evolve over changing technology. We saw the Affero GPL trying to close sort of the SAS loophole. We've seen most recently the cryptographic autonomy license approved, which is focused on both liberating the code as well as the data that a user needs for that to be useful. So we've seen experimentation on driven by sort of values, driven by changes in the technology, and frankly, driven by money too, right? I mean, you look at the rediscovery of source available licensing and the apparent gold rush that's happening there. And these are not new. And one of the points that I really appreciate that somebody made there was, this is, so I mentioned that OS Open Source Initiative is sort of a standards organization. And people want sort of stability and predictability with how licenses behave. I appreciate that there's this experimentation going on at the edges in all of these different areas for all of these different reasons, because I think what we're going to see is, what we are seeing around ethical source, for instance, is a level of focus and investment that we have not previously seen in licenses of that style. And what I like and what I hope to see is, as that goes on, we see a greater core of stability in how those things behave, to the point that you've got your sort of Creative Commons analog where you can mix and match. Here are the things that I'm trying to achieve with my license. Great, that's the license for me. Here we go. Whether or not we ever get to a point where we say like, okay, well, this corner of ethical source is compatible with the open source definition or not, I don't know. But the experimentation is happening, and I really look forward to getting to the point where we can have those conversations again, because I know in the last few years, a lot of the discussion has been like, oh, well, that's not open source, which might have been true, but honestly, it's so early that it's really questionable whether that's a meaningful discussion for us to have. So I just want, the points that I'm making are really that like experimentation has been the name of the game for a long time. Stability is an important part of licenses and seeing adoption. And I think that the investment that we're seeing by the ethical source movement, I think it's really interesting, and I'm curious to see where this gets us over the next few years.
And Josh, I love the idea of a drag and drop license. That sounds pretty good. And there's a question from the audience that reads pretty similarly: is can you combine multiple licenses, or can you apply multiple licenses to your project? Let's say the Hippocratic or another license, if it doesn't cover all of your needs.
People do it all the time.
Yeah. You can
I wanted to say,
combine.
Nell, you should see that from crawling these
Yeah,
projects.
some do. What they usually do is they take the SPDX, or Software Package Data Exchange identifier for the license. That's another standard of identifying licenses, and clearly defined tracks projects which have an SPTX compliant license. And then they use an and joiner to join the licenses together. That's me saying that from a technologist point of view. I don't know what the legal point of view is on that, so I will defer to the lawyers for that. But there are ways that people do it using and. You can even use or combinations with parentheses. It's pretty fascinating how people do it.
It's very, when people do that, I mean, my first response is that that's really good for the lawyers. We get paid a lot of money to explain how that and that or, I think, often that's in response to it. Like, that's something you should only, like, it can work, but almost always what ends up happening is that the more we speak of a piece of term of art that Simon uses, copyleft, which is essentially a license that tries to use copyright to force other people who are using your code to share their code. That's a little bit of a gross oversimplification, but that's the basic idea. There's another category of license that we usually call, the most common label for it is permissive, which basically is do whatever you want, usually with a requirement that there be some kind of attribution. And so what often people do is they'll combine some flavor of copyleft and some flavor of permissive. And as a practical matter, what that means is the vast majority of your users are just going to use it under the permissive terms, which is not what people think they're going to get, right? So like I can imagine, the original question mentioned the Hippocratic license. I can imagine people trying to get creative about like Hippocratic, but also like people are going to end up choosing the but also, right? Most of the time, which might be what you want, but often like, it can be just hard even for professionals to understand exactly how those interact. And so try not to overthink it would be my advice.
There's standard exceptions too. Like you can, I'm not recommending this, but again, not a lawyer here, just a technologist, though I'm married to one. You can say it's this license with this standard exception. So there's lots of different ways of formatting it.
Yeah, I actually had this conversation, I think, about.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say I had this conversation with somebody on Twitter about 2 months ago about this exact idea of like combining. In this case, it was like the Hippocratic license with, I think their version was like a GPL license, and I think it's always questionable when you, as a general matter, when you're trying to just like clump two licenses together. Even if you say and or like Louis said, like it gets very technical very quickly. I would say the general advice is always to try to find one license that fits your needs. But if you have to combine licenses, it's, would a 50 or 60-year-old gentleman sitting on the bench who has a very basic understanding of the English language, but does not understand your field of, your field of endeavor at all, would they understand what the license covers? Would they understand how it's enforced? And if the answer is no, I would tend to stay away from that, because those are likely going to be the judges that you're asking to enforce your license.
Nice one.
Yeah, that's a great point. We have this whole body of specialist knowledge that the judges and courts may completely choose to ignore, right? Like there's something that we all like, basic law that we learn in contract law is the four corners rule. Like if a judge can resolve a contractual dispute by looking just at the four corners of the contract, i.e. nothing outside, that's what they're going to do, right? So we've written these FAQs, like literally the GPL FAQ is like 22 or 24,000 words. There's no guarantee that a judge will even acknowledge that the FAQ exists, when a GPL goes to court. So is that going to help you or hurt you? Who knows?
All right. So on that very positive note, another audience question: what can be the consequences of choosing the wrong license? And maybe as a follow-up, what's involved with changing a license?
So I'll make a first go at this. What might it mean to choose the wrong license? So for instance, it may be that you are building a library or a framework in a given ecosystem. Let's say it's in Java. Java is an ecosystem in which Apache license version 2 is very common. And I will tell you now that if you pick an open source license that's not Apache, you will see less adoption than you might otherwise. That might be okay. It may be that you don't need to maximize for adoption. However, if you really do want uptake of your project, usually the best thing you can do is pick a license that's already standard in that ecosystem. You look at Java and it's Apache license. You look at JavaScript and that's often BSD or MIT. It really varies per ecosystem. So the first consequence of choosing the wrong license might just be that you're inhibiting adoption. Now, what do you do if you find, actually, let me rewind. There are other ways in which you might argue that people might get hurt by choosing the wrong license. I alluded to the rediscovery of source available licensing recently, and that's a veiled reference to, you look at Elastic, you look at Mongo, you look at Sentry, Redis, half a dozen or more companies recently that have taken open source projects that they were stewards of and then relicensed them to something that is closed source or source available at least. Right. And so, I would argue that maybe the license they chose at the beginning wasn't really a match for the business model that they were going for. Or maybe it was, and then their investors disagreed with them. Who knows? But, so on the one hand, you want to choose the right license based on who you want to see adopting this. If you're trying to build a business around an open source project, which is doable, but I think a lot of people do it wrong, that's an area where you really want to invest in thinking very critically about how you choose your license and what license you choose. Now, what do you do if you get to a point and you decide, you come to discover, oh, I chose the wrong license? I'm not a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer. I'm not anyone's lawyer. But I will tell you that part of open source contribution is that unless there is something like a contributor license agreement, a CLA that you sign when you contribute to an open source project, you still retain ownership, copyright ownership of the code that you have contributed to that project. So I created like the feeds meetup module for Drupal. It only ever had one contributor, and that was me. But let's say that there were other contributors to that project. They would be contributing under that license, but they would still own their contributions. So if I wanted to relicense the feeds meetup module, the project, I would not only need to agree to do that myself for the parts of the code that I retain copyright ownership for, but I would need to get consent from the other contributors that I can also relicense their contributions. So changing license can be very difficult. It tends to be something that you want to avoid at all costs. And it is something that, this is one of the reasons why a lot of companies will require you to sign a CLA before you contribute to their open source projects, because they want to have the right to relicense it. I'm not going to put a value judgment on that right now, but
well, that's too bad, because I actually wanted to ask, would you suggest that maintainers think about a contributor license agreement for their projects? You don't?
I think contributor license agreements are hostile. I don't like them. I think they're sort of in opposition or at odds with the spirit of open source. So I like to discourage them.
Right, but I can imagine, say that you are in that situation where you're changing your license and you have a couple of contributors that you don't really know in real life, and you have to go, buy GitHub handles, for instance, that it might be really difficult to find them and be able to talk to them and talk about them consenting to a different license type.
I think it's good practice, at least if you are going to change the license, to do a new version of the software. I'm not sure whether that should be major version or breaking change, but it works much better to do that than to try to change it on software that already exists in the wild. It's a much more polite way to change the license on your project.
It's an API contract. It's absolutely a major breaking change. Yeah. What was it? What happens if past contributors have passed away? Unfortunate, but a very real case. Yeah, very, very real. I mean, there's a whole lot of reasons, but that said, there are, you do need to think about that, but there can be ways around that short of a CLA, right? Among other things, if it's a permissively licensed project, you can add new code under the new license. So if somebody needs to use the whole thing, they have to comply with both licenses, which is going to mean both the more restrictive and the more permissive, because in that case, the license is and, not or. But that's something that is tricky, and of course, if people can exclude or cut out the new code, then they've effectively broken the two things apart, right? I think another thing to remember with changing the license is that the old version is always still there and still under the old licenses. So we see that, for example, recently, some projects have changed from a permissive license to AGPL or to a commercial source license, and Amazon has said, "Great, we're going to take the last Apache licensed version and we're going to build a whole new community around that." Because the licenses, Sami and I have talked about judges and courts but like these are also community documents, right? So like there's no enforcement that's gonna go on in that case, right? Like there actually is some litigation, but that's a weird situation in that particular case. But but what's happened in the community, an existing community of users and contributors, feels sort of taken advantage of. And so, Amazon is saying, hey, we will give these people a new home to work around the old code base. And that you can't single-handedly changing a license, even if you're purely 100% legally, right? Because this company had a CLA, so it was completely within their lawyers could sit there and say, oh yeah, you can change the license, do whatever you want. And the community people were probably crying in their soup, right? And that's a reality that goes beyond what's legal. A thing that I really like to remind lawyers in particular in this space is that what's legal and what's the right business strategy are often very divergent.
Interesting. All right, I wanna change gears a little bit. Josh, the OSI advises against using Creative Commons. Yet that's one of the licenses that you can choose from a drop-down menu when you host your source on GitHub. I think many people are familiar with that brand. So why would you advise against Creative Commons?
So there were some versions of Creative Commons licenses that were submitted for review by the Open Source Initiative's license review process at some point. The licenses were voluntarily withdrawn from review. It was complicated discussions that I wasn't there for, so I'm not going to try to characterize them. What I will say is that the Creative Commons licenses are first and foremost excellent. They are excellent documents that have, in my view, really taken the spirit of open source and helped bring us open access and open science and so many other things that I think are just awesome. So huge fan. Those licenses were not written for software. Software is, as much as I like to say that, we are blue collar workers doing plumbing with computers, and that we're not that special. Well, software is a strange beast in terms of how the intellectual property works, and so the licenses need to be written with that in mind. And Creative Commons was broadly not written that way. It is written to apply very effectively to imagery, to data, even sometimes to text and writing, and in those cases, it's absolutely suitable. But it was just not written for software. Now, what I will say, there is one narrow area in which I think I have seen Creative Commons used often, not often, but seen it applied to code in non-trivial amounts, and that it's like not ideal, but it's also not the worst thing. I believe it is Amazon who has the policy in which all of their sample code is licensed under CC0, which is effectively a public domain dedication. That's fine. If it's sample code, sure. But like if you're really looking for adoption, you need to use a license that is written for software. And so, I believe the drop-down menu that GitHub uses, I think that might be sourced from choosealicense.com. Choosealicense.com has its own interesting provenance, and I think maybe Creative Commons should be discouraged for software. I don't know how I feel about it being a recommended option in a drop-down list, but it's certainly an option.
Because that's definitely what it feels like, right? That it's a recommended choice if it's in the drop-down on GitHub, which is for software, no? But Nell, I don't know if you have any numbers or clearly defined has any numbers on maybe projects that use Creative Commons and that are not necessarily maybe for imagery or data like Josh suggests.
I'm going to pull that up right now. Please come back to me in a minute.
Awesome. I'd love it. So then I'll cover another audience questions in the meantime while we wait. Question from the audience: how do you protect ethical source if even mainstream GPL isn't fully funded to be enforced?
I mean, I think it starts with adoption. And while, once I think we have a large enough community that's adopting it, I think that in and of itself will lend businesses to curb their behavior. I think Nell spoke about this a little bit earlier about how, if you just the fear of enforcement sometimes is sufficient with corporations. But the other thing is that, I mean, one of the things we're looking at in the ethical source space isn't just looking at it from the relationship between the software developer or the developers and the company that's licensing the product, but also talking about third-party beneficiary language, right? Where we're saying that, anybody in your supply chain that's impacted by human rights abuses, you have the ability, you have a duty to those people, and by violating the license, anybody can then come back and have a private right of action against you and can file a complaint against you. And this isn't unique to the Hippocratic license. There's several licenses that are kind of viewing this, right? Like I think the anti-996 license talks about certain provisions that protect employees for reporting. And so there are other ways to get around protecting ethical source than just funding. Funding is part of that, right? Litigation costs for enforcement and pulling the license always exists. But honestly, sometimes a strongly worded demand letter to a company saying, like, look, you're violating the license, you have 30 days to remedy the situation, or the license is pulled and you don't have the ability to use it anymore, I think a lot of times, especially the lawyers advising these companies will say, look, you're at risk for an enforcement action, to come against you. Maybe you don't want to play around with this. Either remedy the situation or stop using the license. I think people hear litigation costs, and especially in intellectual property, I think people feel that enforcement is strictly through these $1 million lawsuits. And honestly, especially when we're talking about a copyright context, it doesn't get that high ever, or I shouldn't say ever, rarely. Rarely. And I feel like when a lot of people hear those numbers, they think about patent litigation cases and why it gets that high. But copyright litigation is much less costly, at least on average. And there's other ways of other enforcement mechanisms beyond going to court and litigating the case.
So getting back to the question, I actually don't offhand have access to the number of or percentage of components tracked by Clearly Defined that use Creative Commons. I can tell you the vast majority use MIT, followed by Apache 2.0, followed by ISC, BSD3, BSD2, and a few others.
Awesome. Well, that's super interesting. Why do we think that those are the most used licenses?
I
Anyone
know my
wants to have a
project's probably going to be okay if I use one of those. is what I think of when I create a new project.
Yeah, from another data source, I also had that the most common licenses are MIT, Apache version 2, and GPL version 3. So I didn't hear those the GPL in your list, I think, Nell. But
we have GPL. Well, there's a few different GPLs, but it's around 1.5% of the 12 million or so components that we track. So it is there, and it might be that it's on languages that we don't track the packages for just yet. We've tracked for many languages, but not for all of them. But we're working on that. Yeah,
because Josh, you said that Apache is very common in the Java community. So are the other ones often used in other communities that are pretty big?
Let's see here. For gems, it's MIT is the most frequent.
For Python, it's BSD, I think, by default, or PSF license, which is much of there's actually a real difficulty. I was also on the board of the open source initiative many years ago, and we looked at there's a list on the open source initiative website of popular, widely used licenses, which was, and that list was created in 2005, I think, and has not been updated since. And so we looked at using a data-driven approach to updating that. And it's really hard because it's very dependent on how you sample and things like, so for example, Clearly Defined, I'm guessing with that 12 million number, Nell, is that including releases, like each version?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So any language that encourages fast releases over languages that encourage, for various cultural reasons, slower releases is going to look is going to come up higher in that ranking, for example, right? Whereas if you count by projects versus releases, and again, do you include C or C++? The Boost license, which I'd never heard of in years, turns out it's huge in C++. And so there are a lot of these kinds of, I think actually really great. Somebody asked earlier, what happens if I choose a bad license? The flip side of that is the simplest, best way to choose a good license, or not necessarily good, because I think we can get into some complexity around your business goals and your ethical goals. But the way to not shoot yourself in the foot is to look around you at your specific community, right? If you're a C++ person and you're releasing C++, then Boost, it turns out, is probably going to be fine for you, right? Similarly, Java, it's either Apache or Eclipse. Rust is very much a MIT. My biggest regret as an attorney is that I did not write a permissive MPL, and because I led the writing of Mozilla Public License version 2.0, and we talked about writing a more permissive version of it that would have been appropriate for something like Rust, and Rust came out right after I left the organization, and so it just wasn't quite there yet. But yeah, you look around at who am I trying to get adoption by, and that is that community is going to send you huge signals, and they're mostly choosing very well respected, battle tested licenses, right? But you can also choose. There was a new I don't know if it's an ethical license per se, but a project, shoot, whose name is escaping me, released a license recently that ties the license to their code of conduct. So basically, if there's a code of conduct violation, you can lose the license, right? It's intended to be sort of a stick, and of course, an obvious an obvious like counter to this is that even companies that are very well intentioned have minor or large code of conduct violations all the time, right? So they're going to be reluctant to adopt a project like that. And the authors of this license are, you know what? You know who we care about? We care about the word they used in their writing about it was neighborly. And like, you know what? For them, adoption, like, yeah, that license is, with no offense to Microsoft, right? Probably going to freak Microsoft licenses, probably going to freak Microsoft's lawyers out. And, and if I were in their shoes, I would be freaked out by it too, right? But this community doesn't, like, they've made a conscious choice that they are okay with being a smaller. I tweeted about it and used a Cheers, Cheers splash screen, right, where everybody knows your name. Like, they're okay with losing adoption, in the for that trade-off.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned intentions at one point, and I think on the ethical source website it also says like we're not looking at intentions but at impact. And I think you had the name of the license that Luis was referring to, right, Sami?
Yeah, Josh said it too. It was the ML5JS.
Then I missed it.
I think they missed an opportunity to call it the Mr. Rogers license. That's what I think of when I hear neighborly.
It's a good one. Right. So another question. The Dutch tax administration has this wonderful line. It goes like, "We can't make tax more fun. We can, however, make it easier." I suspect that a similar sort of statement is true for licensing. So this is a question for the group: how we make it less of a daunting subject and further raise awareness? Not everyone at once.
I think it's one of those topics that it's very much you get in what you get out of it what you put into it, right? If this is something that you if you care about how your license is used, and what projects and what that can be worked on as a result of your software, then this is something that you really want to get into, because this is really about the nuts and the bolts of things. But if you're very like big picture vision, I just want this out there. I want this out there as quickly as possible. It's hard for it to be fun, and I think that's part of the the nature of the beast, right? Is the allure is there if you care about the nuts and the bolts, and if you're very big picture, look, I just want to I want to write my software and I want to get it out there as quickly as possible. I feel like it's hard to be passionate about it. And I mean, I think that's true of any endeavor, right? Like, as I am a human rights attorney. I love intellectual property law. But, if you ask me to say like, hey, like I need you to, handle this really simple status call in a criminal case, I'd be like, I don't really want to. And so that's just part of the nature of the beast.
I mean, I think Sami's too, humble to toot his own horn here, but like, there's the if you really want to get into the nuts and bolts, a way to get into the nuts and bolts is to get involved with a community that cares about it, right? So like the ethical open, I forget what the name of the org is now. Ethical EOS.
OES, Organization for Ethical Source.
OES. OES, Organization for Ethical Source. The Debian community has long been, you can't become a member of the Debian community without passing a test about licensing. Like that's the kind of way to really dig yourself in, is to hang out with other people who really want to dig in.
My hope is that we can give people just enough information about licenses to be able to feel somewhat confident, at least navigating that space, right? Not that everybody needs to be an attorney, but we could probably do a little better with license education. And one of the things that I really hope to see is that we we push some of that education out to sort of to the edges. I mean, yes, Open Source Initiative is working on that education stuff. You know, we're working with Brandeis University. We're putting together curriculum. We're working with our affiliates to make sure that that information is getting out there. But what I hope to do, what I hope to see, is a lot of that education happening in those communities, right? So people who are passionate about this stuff, yeah, please come to the Open Source Initiative. Please, or to the Organization for Ethical Source if that's where your interest and passion is. Go to both. Let's geek out about licensing. But for most people are not that interested, and I do not blame them. You know, I came up as a web developer. Open source was just the water we swam in. Didn't even notice it. What I would have loved is if I, as a person who developed often with PHP and Drupal and WordPress and MySQL, it would have been fabulous if in those communities there was a little more, just the slightest patina of discussion of licensing. Like, here's why Drupal chose this license, and here's why our module ecosystem uses these licenses. Because then that would help me as somebody who's just trying to get my work done, at least absorb some of that by osmosis and realize that it's something that this community values. They made an intentional decision around it. And that will help set my expectations when I go and create my own project. Because that's where the education needs to happen. You know, it needs to happen in the spaces where these contributors exist. Because 99.9% of people are not going to bother engaging with OSI or EOS. And that's okay.
Part of another reason Clearly Defined exists is to, if you're working on software that uses a ton of pieces of open source software, we have an API that Microsoft uses to check its open source, or all software that uses open source software, as well as other organizations. So you can even integrate it into your CI tooling. We're working on a way to do that easier, to say, all right, I'm going to scan all the dependencies of the software, the dependencies of the dependencies. You know, it's debatable how far down you should go, but I can confirm that all of them are these approved licenses, or this one does not have a license that's on our list. So let's escalate this to the developer, to escalate to a lawyer to get the okay on it. So there are ways to, if you don't want to think about it that much, there are ways to automate it if that's the type of engagement you would prefer.
Great. Also,
yeah, though then we get into the question of metadata and how we license all this stuff, and that is oh boy, like if you're like, just to break some programmer brains here, in theory, copyright can apply, multiple copyrights can occur in one file. So then multiply that across the entire project, which by the way, might have different licenses for tests, for documentation, for the code base itself, for build frameworks that might not be shipped with the final product. So actually complying in the like way lawyers want you to comply is actually one of the prime things I had in mind early on when I said lawyers are too conservative and demand too much. And I think actually like the way we do compliance is maps very poorly to the real world. But that's maybe a discussion for over a beverage of choice with Nell and many others.
Or a follow-up meetup. All right, as a follow-up on the previous question, for someone who would like to be more versed in the whole software licensing world, what resources would you recommend? Asking for a friend. Don't say the OSI website, but beyond that. So Josh, you mentioned before, or you referenced the choosealicense.com. I kind of like it. I think for a beginner, it's maybe kind of good because it's sort of if this then that, and it gives a couple of examples of what projects, and you said that was important. What projects in your sort of space use what kind of license, but what other tools are out there if choose a license is maybe not the best thing?
There is no one destination I could point you to that I would be fully confident of pointing you to. And I certainly am not going to recommend the Open Source Initiative website here, because that's not the information we provide. We say, here are these licenses, they're blessed as open source definition compatible. These are the ones that are popular. Other than that, feel free to make some choices on your own, which is far short of an education. ChooseAlicense.com is a fine starting place. For people who really want to dig in, there are really excellent, there are courses that are being developed. They are CC licensed, so you can use them at your leisure and don't need to pay for them. I would start at ChooseAlicense.com and go from there. And if you're really, really interested and you want to learn, there is a License Discuss mailing list that the Open Source Initiative maintains, which is a great place for people to ask questions.
Awesome. Could you pull up the link for the peeps watching? That'd be awesome.
I think all of our hesitation a little bit in terms of like pointing to a specific website goes to Josh's earlier point that we've done a poor job as a community of educating software developers on how licensing functions. And I think that like kind of, I point that lens at myself and attorneys generally first, is that, we need to do a better job of, educating the community, because a lot of them are making these decisions and sometimes they don't want to engage an attorney because they're worried about the costs of it. And so to that end, I would say, especially if you're interested in ethical licensing, that feel free to reach out to me. I have my Twitter here. My email is Samuel@corporateaccountabilitylab.org. If you go to the Corporate Accountability Lab website, it's readily available. So I'm available as a resource to software developers who want to learn, even if it's just general information about licensing, just to say, what does enforcement look like? I'm looking at licensing options. Can you help me out? I'm absolutely, here for you. And then especially if you want to look into the ethical licensing space, I've had the opportunity not just to work with OES, but other contributors in the OES, in that space, who have their own licenses that they're developing and have conversations. So, I think we need to do better as a community, but at least as a starting point, I would say feel free to reach out.
Is there anything we would like to see in this space? Like if we had all the time, and I know we talked about hobbies just before we went live, and that we have too many of those. But if like time and which is perfect. But if we would have all the time and monies in the world, like what would we like to see in terms of educating people around copyright and licensing?
I have two thoughts that I've been kind of like mulling around about this, and the first one is that I think it would be great to have a place where anyone, but in particular software developers, to be able to go and say, this is how licenses are enforced globally. I don't think we do enough of that. I think very often we look at them very regionally or nationally, but because this is the internet has made the world a globalized space. How licenses are enforced in these different areas is really valuable. And then the other thing, and this is something that I don't know very much of like how this would function. This is a very long-term goal, but looking at arbitration, not in the general sense that I feel like most lawyers kind of fear, but thinking about it in the way script writers in Hollywood think about it, which is like, that's a community where if there are issues with the way the scripts, if there's conflicts with, script writing between them and a production company, then there's the tribunal between screenwriters that kind of deal with legal issues, and those the results of that arbitration are legally binding, and they go to court and have it enforced, to kind of maybe see that in a software development space, and see if eventually the community can get enough funding and strength to be able to say, okay, this is how we're going to look at enforcement of copyright licenses, and make that litigation cost absolutely reduced. And I think those are things that I would love to see in this space. But I think that those are things that are long-term future goals, and we have a lot of room, a lot of things to improve on before we get there.
I would love to see some website with, Here are the 10 most common licenses. Here's a 101 discussion of them. And then at the end have, if you're looking to do this, you should talk to a lawyer before you use this one. And obviously that will never be entirely comprehensive. But I mean, I think Twitter is an awful place to have, well, a lot of discussions, but especially license discussions. Whenever a big controversy breaks out, I usually tweet a GIF of Baby Yoda, Grogu, just sipping his tea and say, that's me. I'm just watching it. I'm not going to participate in it. But having, just some functional 101, maybe 201 area that answers the most common questions that are most likely going to come up, and then tell people if you're getting beyond these, that's when you should talk to a lawyer. I think that'd be very helpful.
I will add, though, that I think part of the kind of barrier to entry with this is that so often a lawyer's response to, or even just the way licensing will function, is that it really depends on the circumstances. And I think people people hate hearing that, but I feel like that's the typical lawyer answer of, it depends. And but it does. It so often does. And I think that that's a barrier that we're going to have to overcome, but one that certainly exists.
I think that's the standard engineer answer as well, by the way. Any other takers? A licensing chatbot?
Lewis, you want to
actually,
I see like Grinch.
this is the reverse of a lot of what we've been doing. We taught people for a long time that licensing was how you got ethics in software. And I wish I could undo some of that, right? Because it's not a magic, to the extent that that was ever true, it was true in part because it was embedded in a broader movement that was not just writing licenses. It was writing code. It was building a community. It was doing enforcement, and so I think there's become a little bit of almost a mystique around licenses, that the licenses by themselves, if you just write the thing and put it out there in the world. And to be clear, I think one of the great things about OES is that it is thinking about these things in a more sophisticated way. But I think there's a lot of people who, it's like, oh, well, this is a legal document, it must do legal things. And it's like, no, a legal document is embedded in so much other context that if you don't think equally as hard about that other context, the license is really just, and that's true, like both if you're trying to, build ethics into your or build community. And for a long time, like, again, more of a little bit less now, but for a long time there were people just, oh, I'll just release this code under an open license and then magically a community will happen.
People
and
appear.
It's like, no. Like, then you have to do all the other work of building a community, like talking to human beings, and a lot of people are like, no, I don't want to.
I don't want to do that.
Beings. Yeah.
Open source is not free labor. It's not free. Even when someone makes a contribute, there's labor involved in reviewing it, merging it, deploying it, etc.
It's free as in puppies, free as in a piano. Yes. It requires care.
Somebody told me recently that it's Goodwill Hunting in reverse. You start as a genius and you end up as a janitor.
Yeah, that's
I've never seen
really
Goodwill Hunting.
It's a good movie, but
oh, I feel like that's the biggest tragedy of this conversation. You haven't seen Goodwill Hunting.
Yeah, I was also a teenager in the '90s, so of course I saw it. But yeah.
I would love to
homework for now.
If we had all the time and resources in the world, I would love to see a great deal of education put together. I would love to see universities doing more than a cursory brush with intellectual property as part of CS programs. I would love to see boot camps incorporating this curriculum as more and more people go outside of the four-year university education system. I would also like to see less emphasis placed on licenses, or perhaps emphasis placed on licenses only in context of those other things that if you don't invest as much energy into those as you do into choosing your license, then the license doesn't really matter that much anyways. As I mentioned, or at the up top is open source has become overloaded to mean so many different things. when we hear it, we think about how the project is governed. We think about being able to contribute back to it, open issues, things like that. You don't get those things from a license, right? And so what I would love to see more education around is, okay, well, here are sort of considerations in choosing a license. But by the way, like, these things need to be paired with this kind of governance. Because what we've seen over the last few years is that regardless of what license you choose, if your governance is undefined, or your governance is whatever our benevolent corporate or volunteer dictator says, well, then that resource, that community, that project that is presently in the commons, you're operating at the mercy of that dictator, whether they're corporate or volunteer. And so it's so important that we not focus so much on licenses without also understanding how that's just part of a broader set of decision making about the things that we create and whether we're putting them into the commons or not, or which commons we put them into in the first place.
Yes, we need more. I think we need more curriculum maybe on how to be a good open source citizen, and especially in our computer science education. Absolutely. On that note, I do think that we're sort of running out of time. So if there's any like last things that you definitely want to convey to the audience, now would be a good time.
Okay.
Okay, there you go. Yeah.
I will seize this opportunity. Many people have never heard of the Open Source Initiative. And I want y'all to know that the Open Source Initiative is a charitable nonprofit that is of, by, and for the community. Its board of directors is elected by the community. I was elected by the community. If the community didn't like what I was doing, they could choose not to elect me again. If my fellow board members didn't like what I was doing, they could choose not to, give me an officer appointment. Open Source Initiative is a community organization. If you care about this stuff, please get involved. If you don't want to get involved, but you still feel strongly, let us know, because we're listening to feedback, positive and negative, and we're always looking to evolve. And we only evolve when people engage with us and let us know where they're at. So please get involved. We are of, by, and for the community.
I think I'll just part with some closing thoughts. Yeah, technology cannot ever stand still. It's constantly evolving. And I think the way we use that technology, the way we create it, the way we license it is also constantly evolving. What worked in the 90s, before the open source movement's goals essentially were met, that everyone would be using open source software in some context or the other. I mean, that happened, and now we're at the precipice of figuring out what happens next. So I encourage people, come to these conversations. If you don't want to tweet at someone, I understand that. People are a lot nicer often in direct messages, or reach out to me, reach out to a person, I think, rather than reaching out to some random screen name on Twitter. And let's continue having this discussion.
I was going to add, to both Josh and Nell's point, absolutely. I think that this is a discussion that's not going to be, summed up in an hour and a half conversation. It's one that's going to continue to evolve. And as we talk about it, not just, get involved with OSI, get involved with OES, have these conversations, because, just as open source developed as a community, so will the conversation with licensing. OSI will evolve, OES will evolve through community collaboration. And honestly, it gives us as attorneys advising software developers an opportunity to hear from you and understand those business interests and personal interests so much better when we have this open communication. And then when we make those advisements, this is how we're going to move forward, especially in the licensing space, where it's really this unique place where software developers and lawyers meet, and not just these two, because the impact of it is so much further than that. So yes, please continue to stay connected, be involved, and have conversations.
Nothing to add.
No, I think that covers it all pretty well. This has been a great conversation. Thank you for hosting us, Flor.
Thank you for being with me, for joining me today, and thank you for the wonderful conversation. And I hope that a lot of people, after seeing this, maybe in playback, that will get involved in these different organizations and hopefully get involved in the discussion. And maybe after some time we can have another chat and see what's changed and what's new, and continue the conversation. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone watching today. We'll be back again next week when we'll be talking about metrics and telemetry for open source projects. So I hope everybody will be joining again then. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Awkward
you.
wave. That's part of the thing.
Thank you.